The snow had been falling for 3 days straight over Ashworth Manor. No one could leave, and someone didn't want them to. It was Christmas Eve, the kind that looks beautiful on the outside. Candlelight in tall windows, holly on the doors, laughter echoing through stone corridors. But inside that manor, something was very wrong. An old curse, a dead body, and a family full of secrets. They said it was the Christmas curse, an ancient legend that had haunted the Ashworths for generations. But one elderly lady, sitting quietly by the fireplace with her knitting, didn't believe in curses. She believed in people, and people, she knew, were far more dangerous. Miss Marple and the Manor's Christmas curse. Stay with me, because nothing here is what it seems. A most peculiar invitation. The train from London had been running nearly 40 minutes behind schedule, and by the time it finally wheezed and shuddered to a halt at Crabwell Station, the afternoon light had already begun to fail. It was the 23rd of December, and the sky over the Yorkshire moors carried that particular shade of grey which suggests not merely the possibility of snow, but its absolute certainty. Miss Jane Marple stepped down onto the platform with some care. The step was rather higher than she had anticipated, and she gripped her carpet bag, the large one, with a faded cornflower pattern, rather more tightly than was perhaps dignified. A young porter materialized from somewhere and reached for her luggage, and she thanked him with the sort of warm, genuine smile that people in cities had quite forgotten how to give. "Ashworth Manor, is it, ma'am?" the boy asked, loading her 2 cases onto his trolley. "Yes, dear. Is there a car waiting, do you know?" "There is. Mr. Reginald Ashworth's man. Been here since 2:30, he has. Not best pleased about the wait, if you'll pardon my saying." Miss Marple said she quite understood, and made her way through the small station with the unhurried patience of someone who has long since made her peace with the inconveniences of travel. She was 71 years old, though she would not have volunteered the number, and she carried herself with the mild, slightly apologetic air of an elderly lady who expected to be overlooked, which suited her perfectly, as she found that overlooked people tend to observe a great deal more than those who are noticed. The car waiting outside was a large black Daimler, polished to within an inch of its life, despite the weather. The driver, a compact, unsmiling man named Briggs, took her bags without a word and stowed them in the boot with mechanical efficiency. Miss Marple settled into the back seat and drew her wool coat more closely around her. The drive to Ashworth Manor took just under 25 minutes, through lanes that grew progressively narrower and more winding as they left the village behind. The moors stretched out on either side, vast and colourless in the fading light, and here and there a solitary farmhouse stood against the sky, like something painted hastily and then abandoned. Miss Marple gazed out at the landscape with quiet attention, her pale blue eyes moving steadily across it, as though reading a page of text. She had come to Ashworth Manor at the invitation of Mrs. Edith Ashworth, or rather, at the gentle but persistent urging of her nephew, Raymond, who had encountered Edith Ashworth at some literary luncheon in Kensington, and had evidently spoken of his aunt in terms that Miss Marple privately considered rather more flattering than accurate. "She has a remarkable mind for puzzles," Raymond had apparently said, which was not wrong exactly, but did rather reduce what Miss Marple thought of as simple human attentiveness to something more like a parlour trick. In any case, Edith Ashworth had written a long, slightly breathless letter, full of dashes and underlinings, to say that she would be simply delighted if Miss Marple would join the family for Christmas. The manor had been in the Ashworth family for 200 years, she wrote. It was a tradition, at Christmas, to invite a few close friends. There would be goose and carols and a proper log fire. She did hope Miss Marple would come. There had been a postscript, added in slightly smaller and less steady handwriting. "I confess, there is another reason I ask. "Things have been rather strange here of late. I should be glad of a sensible person to talk to." That postscript was, of course, the reason Miss Marple had accepted. Ashworth Manor announced itself first as a pair of stone gateposts, each topped with a weathered falcon that had lost most of its defining features to 2 centuries of Yorkshire winters. Beyond the gateposts, a gravel drive curved through a stand of bare oaks before the house itself came into view. And it was, Miss Marple thought, exactly the sort of house that ought to have a curse attached to it. It was large and grey and slightly irregular, as old houses tend to be when they have been added to by successive generations who did not entirely agree with one another about architectural matters. The main body of the building was Georgian, solid and symmetrical, but a Victorian wing had been appended to the east end in a spirit of ambition, which had somewhat outrun good taste. And there was a small stone turret at the northwest corner that appeared to belong to an even earlier period entirely. The whole was softened somewhat by the snow that had begun to fall during the drive, settling on the window ledges and the stone falcons above the door, and the warm light that showed in the downstairs windows was genuinely welcoming. The front door opened before Briggs had quite brought the car to a stop, and a woman came quickly down the steps. She was perhaps 60, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and had not entirely relinquished the claim, strong-boned, clear-eyed, with white hair cut short and practical. She wore a dark green dress and sensible shoes, and her expression as she approached the car combined relief with something that Miss Marple, watching carefully, might have described as anxiety imperfectly concealed. "Miss Marple," she said, as Miss Marple stepped out, "I am so very glad you've come. I'm Edith Ashworth. Did Briggs look after you? It's a wretched evening to be travelling." "He was most efficient," Miss Marple said warmly, "and I must say, the manor is quite beautiful, even in this light." Edith Ashworth glanced back at the house, and something passed across her face, something brief and complicated. "Yes," she said, after a moment. "It is, isn't it?" The entrance hall of Ashworth Manor was everything a Christmas entrance hall ought to be, and Miss Marple took it in with the quiet pleasure of someone who genuinely appreciates such things. A great deal of holly had been arranged along the mantelpiece and wound around the banisters of the staircase. There was a tree, a very tall one, in the corner near the drawing-room door, decorated with glass ornaments in red and gold that caught the firelight beautifully. Someone had placed candles in the deep window embrasures, and the effect, against the darkening glass and the falling snow outside, was very fine indeed. The smell of the place was the smell of all old English houses in winter, wood smoke and beeswax, and something faintly damp beneath it all that no amount of central heating ever quite dispels. "Come through to the sitting room," Edith said, taking Miss Marple's coat. "The others are having tea. I'll introduce you." The sitting room was a long, somewhat crowded room on the right of the hall, with 2 fireplaces and a great many armchairs. It had the slightly over-furnished quality of a room that had accumulated objects over many decades and never been made to give any of them up. There were portraits on the walls. Ancestors, Miss Marple supposed. A long procession of Ashworths, regarding the present generation with varying degrees of skepticism, and glass-fronted cabinets along one wall displaying silver and china and what appeared to be a collection of antique snuff boxes. 4 people were in the room when Miss Marple entered. The first, rising from an armchair nearest the fire, was a tall man of about 45, handsome in a slightly dissipated way, with dark hair going grey at the temples, and the kind of easy, polished manner that either indicates genuine charm or a great deal of practice at imitating it. This was Reginald Ashworth, Edith's elder son, who managed the estate. He shook Miss Marple's hand with practiced warmth and said all the right things about her journey and the dreadful weather and Miss Marple thanked him and observed that his eyes, while perfectly civil, did not participate in his smile. Beside Reginald, on the small sofa, sat his wife, Caroline. She was younger than her husband by perhaps 10 years, a thin, fair woman with the kind of beauty that photographs better than it appears in person, being slightly too precise, too arranged, to be entirely comfortable. She held her teacup with both hands and offered Miss Marple a smile that managed to be simultaneously welcoming and reserved, which is quite a difficult combination to achieve. In the window seat, apparently absorbed in a book and not quite bothering to pretend otherwise, was a young man of perhaps 22 or 23. He was introduced as Thomas Ashworth, Edith's younger son, and Miss Marple noticed at once that he did not resemble his brother in the slightest. Where Reginald was polished and expansive, Thomas was dark and contained, with something watchful about him that reminded her, not unpleasantly, of a cat. He put down his book with what appeared to be genuine effort, shook her hand briefly and said, "How do you do?" in a tone that suggested he was asking as a formality and did not particularly require an answer. The fourth person in the room did not rise, because rising was, she explained cheerfully, a project she generally attempted only once per day now, and she had already used her attempt at luncheon. This was Mrs. Dorothea Price. Call me Dotty, everyone does. A stout, bright-eyed woman of about 75, who was evidently an old friend of Edith's, and who, Miss Marple sensed immediately, missed very little of what went on around her. They exchanged the small, rather pleased looks of two people who have immediately recognized a kindred spirit. Tea was poured, and the conversation turned, as it always does in English country houses during bad weather, to the weather. It was agreed to be exceptional, unprecedented, and probably the result of something, though the assembled company held differing views on what. Miss Marple listened, and drank her tea, and took a piece of shortbread, and watched. She watched the way Caroline Ashworth's eyes moved to her husband whenever he spoke, and the way his eyes did not move to her. She watched Thomas Ashworth turn the pages of his book without appearing to read it. She watched Edith Ashworth pour the tea with hands that were steady enough, but set down the pot with a fractional care that suggested steadiness was being maintained by effort. Something, she thought, is not quite right in this house. Something beyond the ordinary tensions of a family gathering. Something that had caused Edith Ashworth to write a postscript in smaller, less steady handwriting. She would have to be patient and attentive, and she would have to wait. Miss Marple was very good at all three. Dinner that evening was served at 7:30 in the dining room, which was panelled in dark oak and hung with more ancestral portraits, and which was considerably colder than the sitting room, despite the fire that had been laid in the grate. Miss Marple arrived to find the table already occupied by all those she had met at tea, plus one addition, a man named Leonard Forbes, who was the family's physician and had evidently been a Christmas fixture at Ashworth Manor for a number of years. Dr. Forbes was a man of perhaps 60, spare and grey-haired, with the slightly distant manner of someone accustomed to maintaining professional composure in difficult circumstances. He greeted Miss Marple courteously and took his seat to the right of Edith with the ease of long custom. His hands, Miss Marple noticed, were very steady, the hands of a careful man. The meal was excellent. A good clear soup, followed by a roasted pheasant that the cook, Mrs. Baines, had apparently spent most of the afternoon attending to. The wine was a Burgundy, deep-coloured and rather fine, and Reginald Ashworth poured it himself from a decanter that he brought from the sideboard. It was during the second course that old Hayward, the butler, a man so precisely suited to his role that he appeared to have been created specifically for Ashworth Manor and would have looked inexplicable anywhere else, cleared his throat in the way of a man about to say something has been composing for some time. "If I might mention, ma'am," he said, addressing Edith with careful gravity. "It is this evening, the 23rd. Edith Ashworth set down her fork. "Yes, Hayward, I'm aware. The eve of the eve, as it were. Yes." There was a brief silence around the table, of the particular quality that follows a remark that everyone in the room understands, and no one wishes to address directly. Miss Marple looked from face to face with an expression of benign, inquiring vagueness that had served her well on many similar occasions. "I'm afraid," she said pleasantly, "that I don't quite follow. Is there something particular about the 23rd? It was Mrs. Dorothea Price, Dotty, who answered, with the cheerful directness of someone who has decided that the oblique approach is overrated. "The Christmas curse, dear. Didn't Edith mention it in her letter?" "She mentioned," Miss Marple said carefully, "that things had been strange." "Well, the curse is why things are strange, though I use the word advisedly. I don't believe in curses personally, and I've told Edith so." Dotty reached for her wineglass. "The legend, and it is a legend, let us be clear about that, says that every generation or so, on Christmas Eve, someone in the Ashworth family meets their death in the East Wing. It goes back to the 17th century, apparently. A quarrel, a locked room, a body that couldn't be explained, and every time it's happened since, there's been some token beforehand. A cold spot, lights in the East Wing at night, things of that sort. And recently, Miss Marple said, there have been such tokens?" The silence that followed was rather eloquent. "There have been one or two things," Edith said, in a tone that was precisely calibrated to convey that she was being rational about it. "Lights in the East Wing, yes. Mrs. Baines heard something in the corridor upstairs on the night of the 20th, and one of the portraits, the one of Edmund Ashworth, in the study, was found turned to the wall on Tuesday morning, though no one will admit to having touched it." "How very curious," Miss Marple said. She took a sip of her wine and said nothing more. But she was thinking, as she set down the glass, that curses were very rarely what they appeared to be, and that the interesting question was never whether a legend was true, but rather why, at this particular moment, someone had chosen to invoke it. She retired at 10, pleading the fatigue of the journey, and lay in the large, cold bedroom they had given her, a pleasant room in the main wing, with a view over the snow-covered garden, and thought for a long while before she slept. 4 people, plus a doctor, an old house, and an older legend, a woman who had written a troubled postscript and then received her, all smiles, as though nothing were the matter, a butler who kept careful count of the days, and someone, somewhere in this house, who had turned a portrait to the wall. It was, Miss Marple reflected, pulling the eider-down more firmly around her shoulders, a most peculiar invitation. She was rather glad she had accepted it. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and silent, over Ashworth Manor. The legend of the Christmas curse. Miss Marple was dressed and downstairs by 7:30 on the morning of the 24th, while the rest of the house was still quiet. She helped herself to porridge from the sideboard and sat near the window, where the view over the garden was, in the early morning light, quite lovely. The snow had stopped sometime during the night, and the grounds lay under a clean, unbroken whiteness. A single set of footprints crossed the lawn and disappeared around the corner of the East Wing. Miss Marple looked at the East Wing for a moment, then returned to her porridge. Old Hayward appeared at 10 minutes to 8 to refresh the hot water, and Miss Marple, who had been waiting for him with the patience of someone who knows that butlers are generally the most reliable sources of information in any household, gave him her most pleasant look. "Hayward," she said, "I hope you'll forgive me. I was rather in the dark at dinner last night. About the family history, the legend Mrs. Price mentioned." Hayward set down the water jug with measured precision. He did not show any reluctance to discuss the matter. If anything, There was something in his manner that suggested he had been waiting for someone to ask. "The Ashworth Christmas curse, ma'am. It goes back to 1673. Edmund Ashworth, the third son of the second baronet, was found dead in the east wing on Christmas morning. The door to his room was locked from the inside, and the circumstances were irregular." He paused. The family attributed it to a local woman reputed to have certain abilities. She had warned Edmund that his greed would be the death of him, and that the reckoning would come at Christmas. And since then, 4 further deaths in the East Wing, at Christmas, over the subsequent 280 years. Not in every generation, sometimes 2 or 3 pass quietly. But when it comes unexpectedly, on or near Christmas Day, and always preceded by certain signs. He folded his hands. In 1891, when Mr. Gerald Ashworth died, a heart attack, the doctor said. Though the family was never entirely satisfied, the cook found all the salt cellars overturned on Christmas Eve morning. In 1922, when the first Mrs. Hugh Ashworth died in a fall on the stairs, there were footsteps in the East Wing corridor for 3 nights beforehand. And this year, Hayward permitted himself, very slightly, to look troubled. The lights, seen by myself on 2 occasions, and by Briggs on 1. On the 20th, Mrs. Baines was quite distressed by a breathing sound in the upper corridor at 2 in the morning. And there is the matter of Edmund's portrait, found turned to face the wall on Tuesday morning. It is a large painting, quite heavy. It would not have turned of its own accord. Miss Marple considered this. And the family, how do they respond? Mrs. Ashworth is troubled, but rational. Mr. Reginald treats it as an embarrassment. Mrs. Caroline has said very little, though she does not go near the East Wing. He paused. Mr. Thomas takes it more seriously than he will admit. He has been in the library a great deal this past week, and several of the older volumes on family history have been removed from their shelves. Has he? Said Miss Marple softly. How very interesting. The rest of the household came down to breakfast in stages. Caroline arrived first, carrying a small leather diary, which she set beside her plate and did not open. Reginald came down with the preoccupied manner of a man who has already been on the telephone and is not satisfied with what he heard. Thomas arrived last, from the direction of the corridor rather than the stairs, suggesting he had been elsewhere in the house, with the look of someone who has not slept especially well. He poured himself coffee, took nothing to eat, and sat with the air of someone who had decided to be present without committing to participation. Forbes arrived from the village at 9 o'clock, as was apparently his Christmas Eve custom. In daylight, he was a more distinct figure than at dinner, thin to the point of austerity, with keen grey eyes behind steel-rimmed glasses, and very still, precise hands. He accepted coffee and took it to the window. Comfortable in his own silence, Miss Marple found herself sitting near him, quite naturally, as the breakfast things were cleared. You've heard about the curse, he said. A little. Hayward was kind enough to give me some background. Hayward is the great authority, the doctor said, in a tone carrying the faint quality of a man who regards superstition as a professional inconvenience. He has kept the tradition alive very faithfully for 40 years. I believe in pathology reports and in family stress, which is more than adequate explanation for most of what gets attributed to the supernatural in households like this one. The Ashworths are under considerable strain at present. Financial matters, questions about the estate's future. Christmas has a way of concentrating such tensions. He looked at Miss Marple directly. The curse is a very convenient narrative. Convenient for whom? Miss Marple asked. The doctor looked at her as though the question had surprised him slightly. Then he said, For everyone, I suppose, and finished his coffee. It was Dotty Price who told her the rest. Dotty had remained in the sitting room after breakfast, established in her armchair with a large cup of tea and an air of complete contentment. I was hoping to have a proper talk with you. One can't really say anything at table with Hayward hovering." She set down her cup with a small, decisive click. "I think someone in this house is deliberately stirring up the curse. The lights, the portrait, the sounds. That's not supernatural. That's a performance. The question is, who is performing, and for what audience? And have you a view on that?" Dotty was quiet for a moment. Unusually quiet. "Reginald has debts, quite serious ones. The estate is not in good health. There have been discussions about selling a portion of the land. Thomas is passionately against it. Edith has money of her own. If something were to happen to Edith, the estate would be considerably easier to manage." The words settled into the warm air, and Miss Marple let them settle. "That is a very serious suggestion." "I know it is. I've been sitting with it for 4 days." Dotty looked at Miss Marple steadily. "I wrote to Edith's nephew who wrote to you. That is why you are here, Miss Marple. Whether Edith knows it or not. Is there anyone else? Anyone beyond Reginald who might benefit from a disruption? Caroline might. She has her own money, quite separate from Reginald. And Thomas." She hesitated. "Thomas is harder to read. He's been different this past year. Quieter, more watchful. Something has changed in him, and I don't know what." "And Dr. Forbes?" Dotty blinked, apparently surprised. Then she smiled slightly. "Leonard Forbes has been the family doctor for 22 years, and I have never had any reason to think—" She stopped. "Though now you ask, I find I cannot tell you what Leonard would stand to gain or lose from any change in the family's situation. And that is perhaps something I should have thought about rather sooner." She looked at Miss Marple with a new, considering expression. "You're not really just a friend of Raymond West's, aunt, are you?" "I am exactly that," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Nothing more complicated than that at all." She picked up her knitting and began to count the stitches, and said nothing further on the subject. But she was thinking, as the needles moved with their soft, rhythmic click, that the Christmas curse of Ashworth Manor was a very old story, and that old stories were most dangerous when someone young and desperate decided to make use of them. Outside, it had begun to snow again. The afternoon passed quietly. A little too warm near the fires, a little too cold away from them. At 4 o'clock, the household gathered in the drawing room for the lighting of the tree. Reginald lit the electric candles, and Hayward carried in mulled wine, which Miss Marple found excellent, cloves and cinnamon and something warm and slightly medicinal beneath. She watched the candles on the tree and the faces around her, and thought that something was building in this house, some pressure gathering itself like weather before a storm. At 4:30, Thomas Ashworth said, quietly, but clearly enough for everyone to hear, "I found something in the library today. In one of Grandfather's journals, he wrote about the 1891 Christmas, Gerald's death. He said the doctor at the time told him privately that Gerald's heart failure was accelerated. His word, accelerated. Thomas looked at no one in particular, and at everyone. He thought Gerald had been helped along. The room was very quiet. It was Dr. Forbes who spoke first. "Old journals are not medical records, Thomas." "No," said Thomas. "They're not." He put down his mulled wine, untouched, and left the room. Miss Marple looked into her glass and noticed, quite absently, that her hands were cold, which was strange. As she was sitting rather near the fire, she made a small mental note of the kind she frequently made and very rarely shared, and returned to watching the candlelight on the ornaments of the tree, red and gold and flickering, and waited for Christmas Eve to continue. The body in the east wing. Miss Marple did not sleep well that night. This was not, she told herself firmly, because of anything so foolish as atmosphere. She was not susceptible to atmosphere. She had slept perfectly soundly in houses considerably more unsettling than Ashworth Manor, and she was not about to permit a quantity of Christmas candles and an old butler's careful recitations to disturb her rest at the age of 71. The difficulty was, in fact, purely practical. The bedroom they had given her, pleasant enough in daylight, proved, after midnight, to have a radiator that produced a knocking sound at irregular intervals, which was precisely the sort of thing that becomes unbearable once noticed. She lay in the dark and listened to it knock, and between the knocking, she found herself listening to the house itself. The particular vocabulary of sounds that old buildings accumulate over centuries, the settling and shifting and occasional inexplicable creak that is not supernatural but sounds, at 2 in the morning, as though it might be. She was awake, therefore, at 20 minutes past 2, when she heard something that was not the radiator and was not the house. It was a sound from the corridor, or perhaps from somewhere beyond the corridor, distant enough to be uncertain, close enough to be real. A single sharp sound, like something falling or something striking a hard surface. It came once and did not repeat. Miss Marple lay still for a moment, listening. The house settled back into its nighttime quiet. The radiator knocked twice, then stopped. She got up. She put on her dressing gown and her wool slippers. She had packed them specifically, knowing that old houses in December are indifferent to the comfort of their guests. And she took the small electric torch she kept in her carpet bag as a matter of routine, and she opened her bedroom door very quietly and looked out into the corridor. The corridor was dark, except for the thin grey illumination that a snow-covered landscape provides through a curtained window, just enough to see by, if one's eyes had adjusted, which Miss Marple's had. She stood in her doorway and looked both ways along the corridor, and saw nothing. No light under any door, no movement. She stood there for perhaps 2 minutes, listening. Nothing. The corridor was cold, distinctly colder than her room had been, and she drew her dressing gown more closely around her, and entirely silent. She went back to bed. She lay awake for another 40 minutes, turning the sound over in her mind, and then fell into the light, serviceable sleep of someone who has decided that further wakefulness serves no useful purpose. It was Hayward who found him, at 7:30 on Christmas morning, while Miss Marple was still in her room, performing her morning ablutions with the methodical patience that she applied to all things. She heard from somewhere in the house below a sound quite different from anything she had heard the night before. Voices, raised and rapid, with the particular quality of urgency that cannot be mistaken for anything else. She was dressed and downstairs in 8 minutes, which she considered reasonable. The household was gathered in the entrance hall, all of them, even Mrs. Baines, who stood with her hands twisted together in her apron and her face the color of uncooked pastry. Edith Ashworth stood very straight and very still, in the way that people do when stillness is the only thing between them and something much worse. Caroline had one hand pressed flat against the wall beside her, as though requiring its support. Reginald was speaking, too quickly and too loudly, the way people speak when they are frightened and are trying to sound as though they are not. Thomas was not in the entrance hall. Dr. Forbes was already in his overcoat. "What has happened?" Miss Marple asked, addressing Edith directly. It was Hayward who answered. He stood at the foot of the staircase with the rigidity of a man maintaining his professional composure through an effort of considerable will. "Mr. Thomas Ashworth has been found in the east wing, ma'am," he said. I am sorry to say, he is dead." The east wing of Ashworth Manor was reached by a door at the end of the main first-floor corridor, a door that was, Miss Marple noted, as she followed Dr. Forbes along the passage, noticeably heavier than the other doors in the house. It was of oak, iron-banded, and it opened into a short passage that felt immediately different from the rest of the building. Cooler, quieter, with the particular stillness of rooms that are not regularly used. The passage ended in 3 rooms, a small sitting room, a bedroom, and a third room that appeared to have been used at various times as a study and a storage room indiscriminately. It was in this last room that Thomas Ashworth had been found. He was lying on the floor beside a large oak desk, on his back, his arms at his sides, with an arrangement that struck Miss Marple immediately as slightly too composed for someone who had fallen. His eyes were closed. His face, in the grey Christmas morning light that came through the single window, had an expression of, she searched for the word, and found it, surprise. Not pain, not peace, but the particular arrested expression of someone who has encountered something they did not expect. On the desk above him, an empty wine glass stood beside a scattering of papers. The papers appeared to be pages from an old journal, handwritten, in the brown ink of an earlier century. Several of them had fallen to the floor beside him, as though he had been reading them and they had slipped from his hand. Dr. Forbes knelt beside the body with the swift, economical movements of long practice. Miss Marple stood in the doorway and did not enter the room, not from any squeamishness, but from the recognition that a room in this condition should be disturbed as little as possible, and that she could see a great deal from where she stood. She could see the wine glass. She could see that the papers on the floor were from the same journal Thomas had mentioned the previous evening. She could make out, on the uppermost page, a date in 1891. She could see that the window was latched from the inside, and she could see, on the desk beside the wine glass, a small ring of dried redness on the wood, where a second glass had apparently stood and been removed. Dr. Forbes looked up. His face gave nothing away, but his voice, when he spoke, was careful in a way that careful voices are when they are managing what they say. He's been dead for some hours, 4 or 5, I would estimate. It has the appearance of a cardiac event. He paused. He was a young man to die of the heart. He was 23, Edith said from behind Miss Marple, and her voice was the voice of someone standing at a very great height and looking down. Yes. Dr. Forbes rose. I will need to make some calls. The local police should be informed. In cases of sudden death, particularly in someone this young, it is the proper procedure, and I would recommend that no one enters this room until they arrive. He said all of this in the tone of a man who has done this before, which, of course, as a physician of long practice, he had. Miss Marple watched him as he spoke and noted 2 things: that his hands were as steady as they always were, and that he did not look again at the wine glass. The local police arrived at 9:30 in the form of Detective Inspector Harwell, a solidly built man of about 50, with a Yorkshire accent and the expression of someone who has been pulled away from his Christmas breakfast and intends at some point to mention it. He was accompanied by a young constable whose name Miss Marple did not catch, and who wrote everything down in a notebook with the anxious thoroughness of someone new to the work. Inspector Harwell walked through the east wing with Dr. Forbes, and then walked back through it alone, and then stood in the doorway of the 3rd room for a long moment, looking at Thomas Ashworth's body with the particular quality of attention that distinguishes a good policeman from a merely adequate one. Miss Marple, who had positioned herself at a point in the passage from which she could see both the inspector and the room without being in anyone's way, observed him with the same quality of attention. Then he turned and found her observing him, and the 2 of them regarded each other for a moment with mutual recognition. You'd be the guest from London, he said. From St. Mary Mead, she corrected, pleasantly. In Berkshire. And are you? He paused, apparently choosing his words. Familiar with this sort of situation? I have had occasion, Miss Marple said, to be present when unexpected things happen. Whether that constitutes familiarity, I couldn't quite say. Inspector Harwell looked at her for another moment, then nodded, as though she had said something more definitive than she had. Dr. Forbes thinks cardiac failure. You'll have heard that. Yes. What do you think? It was, Miss Marple reflected, a remarkably direct question for a policeman to ask an elderly lady he had met 45 seconds ago. She appreciated it. I think, she said carefully, that there is an empty wine glass on that desk, and a ring on the wood where a second glass stood, and that the second glass is no longer present. I think a young man of 23 dying suddenly of a cardiac event on Christmas morning in the east wing of a house whose family legend predicts exactly such a death is a remarkable coincidence." She folded her hands before her. "I also think that the papers he was reading are pages from a family journal relating to a previous death in this house, and that Thomas mentioned that journal at tea yesterday in front of everyone." Inspector Harwell was quiet for a moment. "You're suggesting he was silenced?" "I am suggesting," Miss Marple said, "that the question is worth asking." The household was gathered in the sitting room while the inspector conducted his initial inquiries, and the atmosphere was of the particular kind that Miss Marple had encountered before, in rooms where something terrible has happened, and no one is quite yet willing to acknowledge its full dimensions. Edith sat in her chair by the fire, very upright, accepting tea from Hayward with a mechanical courtesy. Dotty sat beside her and said nothing, which, from Dotty, spoke volumes. Caroline was on the small sofa, her leather diary open on her lap, and this time she was writing in it. Small, rapid writing that she angled away from the room. Reginald stood at the window, his back to the room, looking out at the snow. He had been standing there for 20 minutes. He had not, in those 20 minutes, said a single word. Miss Marple sat with her knitting and watched all of them and thought, with the careful, methodical honesty that she applied to her own reasoning as rigorously as she applied it to everyone else's, about what she knew and what she merely suspected and what she had, perhaps, got wrong. She admitted to herself, made an error the previous evening. At tea, when Thomas had mentioned the journal, her attention had moved immediately to Reginald, to the financial pressures Dotty had described, to the question of the estate, to the obvious and well-lit motive that Reginald presented. She had, in consequence, watched Reginald during the subsequent hour with rather more attention than she had given to anyone else in the room, and in doing so, she was fairly sure, looking back, she had not been watching Caroline. She had noticed the diary. She had noticed the brooch. She had observed that Caroline said little about the curse and did not go near the east wing, but she had not, and this was the error, small but real. She had not paid sufficient attention to Caroline's hands during those 20 minutes after Thomas had spoken. She had been watching Reginald's face and had registered Caroline only peripherally, and now she could not reconstruct with confidence what Caroline's hands had been doing. It was a small thing. It might mean nothing. But Miss Marple had learned, over many years, that the things she had not watched carefully enough had a way of becoming important, and that admitting the gap promptly was considerably more useful than pretending it wasn't there. She would watch Caroline more carefully from this point on. Inspector Harwell came into the sitting room at 10:15 and asked them each, in turn, where they had been the previous evening after 11 o'clock. It was conducted without accusation, in the manner of a man gathering information rather than building a case, and everyone answered with the cooperative anxiety of people who wish to be helpful and are also, underneath, frightened. Edith had been in her room from 10:30. Dotty the same. Her room was next to Edith's and she had, she said, heard Edith's light under the door until nearly midnight. Reginald had been in the study until approximately 11, then retired. Caroline said she had gone up at 10 and had taken a sleeping tablet, which she did occasionally when she found it difficult to rest. Miss Marple noted this. Dr. Reforbes had left the manor at 9:30, as was his custom after dinner visits, and had driven back to the village. This could, presumably, be verified. Hayward had been in his pantry until 11, then his room. Mrs. Baines had been in bed by 10. Inspector Harwell wrote everything down with the steady unhurriedness of a man who is reserving his judgments. When he had finished, he looked up and said, with the directness that Miss Marple was beginning to appreciate as characteristic, There'll be a post-mortem. Dr. Forbes understands that. We'll know more in a day or two. The wine glass, Miss Marple said, from her chair. The inspector looked at her. There were 2 glasses, she said. One remains on the desk. One has been removed. I wonder if the constable might check the kitchen and the dustbin, if there is one near the east wing, for a second glass. Inspector Harwell regarded her for a moment. Then he said, Rogers, to the young constable, who closed his notebook and went. Reginald turned from the window. He had gone. Miss Marple noticed, rather pale. What are you implying? He said, looking at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize. It had elements of anger in it, and something beneath the anger that was closer to fear. I'm not implying anything at all, Miss Marple said pleasantly. I simply noticed there had been 2 glasses and thought it might be useful information. Reginald looked at her for a moment longer, then turned back to the window. The fire crackled. The snow outside the window lay flat and white and unmarked, except for the trail of footprints that Briggs had made that morning when he had gone to clear the drive. Miss Marple counted her stitches and thought about poison and waited for Christmas Day to continue. The constable returned at 11 o'clock. He spoke quietly to Inspector Harwell in the doorway of the sitting room, and Harwell listened without expression and then thanked him and turned back to the room. We found a second glass, he said, in the dustbin behind the kitchen. It had been rinsed. No one said anything. The rinsed glass sat in Miss Marple's mind with the clean, cold significance of a thing that is trying very hard not to be found, and she thought about who in this house knew where the kitchen dustbin was, and who would have thought, in the aftermath of whatever had happened in the East Wing, to rinse a glass and put it there, and who would have had the composure to do it carefully enough that it required finding at all. It required, she thought, someone who was not panicked, someone who had planned, or at least adapted. Outside, a single crow crossed the white sky above Ashworth Manor and was gone. 3 faces, 3 secrets. The afternoon of Christmas Day at Ashworth Manor was unlike any Christmas afternoon Miss Marple had spent before. She had never spent Christmas Day in a house where someone had died in the night, and the question of how and why hung over every room like smoke that no window could quite clear. The goose was not served. Mrs. Baines had prepared it nonetheless. It sat in the kitchen, magnificent and redundant, but the suggestion of sitting down to Christmas dinner was made by no one. The day settled instead into an uncertain pattern of tea and silence, and the small compulsive movements of people who do not know what to do with their hands. Inspector Harwell had gone, with the information he had collected, and a formality that promised return. Dr. Forbes had remained. No one had asked him to, and no one had asked him to leave, and he had simply continued to be present in the way of someone who considers himself necessary. Miss Marple had her knitting. She settled herself in the sitting room and prepared to be attentive. Reginald Ashworth came to her at 2:30. He stood for a moment in the doorway, with the air of a man who has made a decision and is not entirely comfortable with it. Then came and sat in the armchair across from her. In daylight and distress, he was a more complicated figure than he had appeared at dinner. The polish was still there, but beneath it, she could see the strain of the past hours, and beneath the strain, something that was not grief exactly, but its near neighbor, guilt. Not necessarily the guilt of having done something. Sometimes guilt is simply the guilt of having thought something, or wanted something, or failed to prevent something. Miss Marple, he said, do you think what happened to Thomas was deliberate? What do you think, Mr. Ashworth? He made a short sound that might, in other circumstances, have been a laugh. I think the rinsed wine glass tells rather a clear story. I think 23-year-old men don't die of heart failure without assistance. And I think I know why someone might have wanted Thomas out of the way. And it makes me feel rather ill. Tell me, Miss Marple said. "The estate is in trouble. I have debts, personal debts, not the estate's, from an investment that went badly wrong 18 months ago. The sum involved is considerable." He looked at the fire. Thomas knew. He'd been going through father's papers and found enough to understand the situation was serious. "He came to me 3 weeks ago and said that if I thought he was going to stand by and watch me sell off pieces of the estate to cover my own mistakes, I was very much wrong. He said he'd speak to Mother. He said he'd go to the family solicitor if he had to." "And would he have done it?" "Yes." Reginald said it simply. Thomas didn't threaten idly. "Were you in the East Wing last night?" The silence that followed was not the silence of someone constructing a lie, but of someone deciding how much truth to offer. "I went to speak to Thomas after 11. I knew he'd be there. He'd been spending his evenings in the East Wing all week. I went to try once more to make him understand my position." He looked up. He was alive when I left. He was sitting at that desk, reading, and he told me to go to the devil, in rather more polished language. And I left. Was there wine? There was a decanter on the desk. And 2 glasses. "Did you drink?" he offered. I refused. I wasn't in a mood for drinking. "And Thomas, did he drink while you were there?" "He poured himself a glass just before I left. I don't know if he drank it. I left immediately after." Miss Marple picked up her knitting. "Thank you, Mr. Ashworth. I think you should tell Inspector Harwell exactly what you've told me." He looked at her sharply. "That gives me motive and opportunity both." "Yes, but it also gives you something rather more valuable, the truth. And the truth is considerably easier to manage than its alternatives." He left shortly after. Miss Marple sat for a moment and thought about what he had told her, and what he had not. The details he had offered were the details that placed him in the East Wing and then removed him from it. The details she would have liked, and had not received, was precisely what Thomas had said in those final minutes before Reginald left. She filed this away and waited. Caroline came at 4 o'clock, carrying 2 cups of tea with the precise steadiness of someone using a small physical task as a structure for composure. She set one in front of Miss Marple and took the chair Reginald had vacated with the air of someone who has decided, after considerable internal deliberation, that a conversation is necessary. In the flat grey light of the winter afternoon, she was more interesting than Miss Marple had thought her. There was something in her face that had not been visible yesterday, a tension that was not quite grief and not quite guilt, with something else besides that Miss Marple could not yet name. "You've spoken to Reginald," Caroline said. It was not a question. "We had a brief conversation. He'll have made it sound manageable. That's Reginald's great gift. He can describe a catastrophe in a tone that makes it sound like a minor administrative inconvenience." She looked at the fire. "It isn't manageable. He owes a great deal of money to people who are not the sort you keep waiting, and the estate cannot cover it. Edith offered, once, 2 years ago, when it was still smaller. Reginald refused. Accepting money from his mother was more than his pride could accommodate. By the time the pride caught up with the reality, the offer had been withdrawn. And Thomas, where did he stand?" Something shifted in Caroline's expression. Thomas loved the estate, not what it represented, the way Reginald does, but the actual place, the land, the house, the specific character of it. He would have done anything to protect it, including exposing his brother's difficulties to their mother? Yes. Without hesitation, she paused. But he was young, and he thought in straight lines, and he didn't consider that someone might not wait for him to make that visit to the solicitor. "No," Miss Marple said gently. "I don't think he did." She looked at Caroline steadily. "Mrs. Ashworth, where were you last evening? Not for the inspector's purposes, for my own understanding." Caroline met her gaze and held it, and Miss Marple observed something unexpected. Not evasion, not calculation, but got the look of someone who is genuinely afraid and has decided that being afraid honestly is preferable to the alternative. I told the inspector I took a sleeping tablet and went to bed at 10. That was true, but I woke at approximately midnight. The tablet doesn't always work. I lay awake for some time. A pause. I heard footsteps in the corridor, going toward the east wing. Between 12 and 1, I think. One set of footsteps, or more than one. One set going, a different set, lighter, I thought, or faster, returning. Perhaps 20 minutes later. Miss Marple was very still. And you said nothing of this to Inspector Harwell? No. Why not? Caroline looked back at the fire. Her hands were completely steady, the hands of someone who has been managing fear long enough that it has become a kind of competence. Because I don't know whose footsteps they were, and naming a suspicion without being certain, in a situation like this, could destroy an innocent person, or a guilty one who cannot be proved guilty, and then knows that you suspect them. She looked at Miss Marple directly. I am not a brave woman. I know my own limitations quite clearly. I think, Miss Marple said, that you are rather braver than you believe, but you must tell the inspector about the footsteps. As a matter of urgency. Caroline nodded, once, and left. Miss Marple watched her go, and revised, quietly, the opinion she had formed of Caroline Ashworth. She had read the precision and self-containment as coldness. They were not coldness. They were the careful habits of someone living in proximity to a frightening situation for some time, and learning to navigate it with the tools available. It was a not uncommon error. She made a small note of it, and returned to her knitting. She found Thomas's room herself. It was his bedroom in the main wing. Hayward directed her to it, with the quiet helpfulness of a butler who has decided she is a person who should be assisted. It was a young man's room, revealing character more clearly than its occupant would have chosen. Books everywhere, actively used, bristling with bookmarks. A desk by the window, covered in papers and notes in a rapid, not entirely legible hand. A road atlas with locations circled in pencil. An appointment diary lying open to the week of Christmas. Miss Marple looked at the diary without touching it. There was an entry for the 22nd of December. Spoke to F. He knows more than he says. Must think about this carefully. F. She stood looking at that single initial for some time, in the quiet of the dead young man's room, while the early dark of December gathered outside and the snow on the sill held its clean, uninformative white. F could be anyone, or F could be Dr. Leonard Forbes, who had been the family physician for 22 years, and who had said, with the careful deflection of a man who knows precisely where the line is, that he believed in pathology reports and that old journals were not medical records. She left the room exactly as she had found it and went to find Dr. Forbes. She found him in the study, a volume open in his hand, and had the immediate impression he had not been reading it, that he was using the appearance of occupation accommodate the reality of thought. He looked up, and his expression did something very small and very brief that she would not have seen if she had not been specifically watching for it. Miss Marple, can I help you? I wondered whether I might ask you about Thomas, his state of mind, recently. You knew him since he was a boy, since he was 8. Forbes closed the book and set it on the shelf. Yes, he seems to have been a purposeful young man. Very. Thomas did not do things by halves. He was also perceptive, perhaps uncomfortably so, at times, for people who preferred not to be perceived too clearly. Dr. Forbes, Miss Marple said, sitting without waiting to be invited, I want to ask you something directly. Thomas wrote in his diary, 4 days ago, that he had spoken to someone he referred to only as F, and that this person knew more than he said. Can you tell me whether that conversation took place with you? The silence that followed was quite long. Yes, he said at last. We spoke on the 22nd, about the death of Gerald Ashworth in 1891. Thomas had found a reference in one of the old journals. the physician's private opinion that the death had been accelerated. He came to me because he knew I had access to the family's historical medical records. He asked whether there was anything that corroborated the journal entry. And was there? There were notes from the physician at the time, Dr. Horace Bellamy. Not conclusive, but suggestive. He noted certain symptoms in the days before the death that he could not entirely explain by natural causes. He pressed his hands together and looked at the desk. My own interpretation is that Gerald Ashworth was probably poisoned, slowly, over several days, by something available in any household in 1891, producing symptoms easily attributed at the time to natural causes. And the method used in 1891, Miss Marple said softly. Would it be known to someone with medical training? Dr. Forbes looked at her. For the first time since she had met him, she saw something beneath the professional composure, the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and is deciding whether to set it down. Yes, he said, it would. Miss Marple thanked him, rose, and left him sitting with his hands folded and his book unread. She went upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed in her wool coat and stared at the wallpaper for a long time. 3 faces, 3 secrets: Reginald, the debt, the visit, the 2 wine glasses he had seen but not drunk from, Caroline, the footsteps in the corridor, the fear she had been managing quietly, and a loyalty she had not yet fully declared, and Dr. Forbes. 22 years with this family, a knowledge of historical methods, a conversation with Thomas 4 days before Thomas died, and the particular careful quality of a man who has understood something and chosen, for reasons of his own, not to act on it until now. Somewhere among them, or between them, was the shape of what had happened to Thomas Ashworth on Christmas Eve. She was not yet certain, but she was closer than she had been this morning. She changed for dinner and sat for a few minutes with her knitting in her lap and did not knit. Tomorrow, she thought, she would know, or very nearly. Outside, the snow had stopped, and the night sky over Ashworth Manor was very clear and very cold and full of stars. Knitting and noticing. Miss Marple woke on the morning of the 26th with the particular clarity of mind that sometimes follows a night of apparently unsatisfactory sleep, the kind where one wakes several times, lies in the dark thinking in circles, only to discover in the morning that the circles had, without conscious participation, resolved themselves into something useful. She dressed carefully, the dark blue wool today, and sat in the chair by the window with her knitting in her lap, and she thought. The difficulty, and she acknowledged it with honest rigor, was that clarity was not the same as certainty, and certainty was not the same as proof. She knew, or believed she knew, the shape of what had happened in the East Wing on Christmas Eve. The wine, the poison, the careful arrangement of the scene to invoke the family legend, the single rinsed glass in the kitchen dustbin, the second set of footsteps Caroline had heard, lighter, quicker, returning from the East Wing 20 minutes after the first. She knew that Reginald had been in the East Wing that evening. He had admitted it freely, and she believed him, not because she was naive about the admissions of interested parties, but because the specific quality of his account had the slightly painful texture of genuine memory rather than constructed narrative. He had been there. He had seen the decanter and the 2 glasses. He had left Thomas alive and reading. She knew that Thomas had died from something in the wine. The rinsed glass told its own story clearly enough, and Dr. Forbes's account of the 1891 death had given her the specific something she had been looking for, digitalis. That was her conclusion, though she had not said it aloud. Foxglove derived, used in medicine in controlled doses for heart conditions, capable in excess of producing precisely the cardiac arrest that Dr. Forbes had attributed to natural causes, available with the right knowledge and connections, without enormous difficulty, and, this was the detail that mattered most, very difficult to detect without a specific and deliberate search in a post-mortem, unless, of course, the examining physician already knew what to look for, which brought her, again and inevitably, to Dr. Leonard Forbes. She had been moving too slowly on Forbes. She had identified him early as someone worth watching. She had noted the steadiness, the precision, the careful habit of answering questions with answers that were true as far as they went, without going quite as far as the question required. She had registered the diary entry, "F knows more than he says," and she had gone to him and asked directly, and he had answered honestly. But honest answers are not always complete ones. A man of Forbes's intelligence would understand perfectly that the most effective concealment is not the lie but the partial truth, the answer that satisfies the question asked, while leaving the question, not yet asked, entirely untouched. She had asked whether Thomas had spoken to him. Yes. She had asked what about the historical death, the old records. She had asked whether the method would be known to someone with medical training. Yes. She had not asked, and this was the gap, whether he himself had had access to the relevant compound, or whether he had at any point been in the East Wing after hours. She had not asked, because she had not yet been certain enough. Asking a man of Forbes's intelligence a direct accusatory question before one is certain is not merely premature, it is dangerous. It warns him. It gives him time to adjust. She must not do that again. She set down her knitting. She had not knitted a single stitch, she realized, and stood and went to the window and looked out at the frozen garden. The footprints from yesterday were still there, preserved by the frost. Briggs's trail to the coal store, the constable's careful path around the east wing, and there, a set of prints she had not noticed before, running along the far edge of the garden near the wall, toward the east wing, stopping at a point near the east wing's side door. She could not tell when they had been made. Before the frost, certainly. They were narrow prints, made by a shoe rather than a boot, belonging to someone who had walked deliberately and not hurried. She looked at them for some time, memorizing the line of them, and then went downstairs. Dotty was in the sitting room, and she was the person Miss Marple most wanted to see, not because Dotty knew everything, but because she knew the family over time, and the perspective of time was what Miss Marple needed now. Dotty was knitting too, a large, complicated project in dark red that had been going on, by the look of it, for some considerable time. She looked up when Miss Marple came in and said, "You've been thinking. Sit down and tell me." "I want to ask you about Leonard Forbes," Miss Marple said. "Not about the present situation, about the past." Dotty set down her knitting with the air of someone putting aside a lesser task. "What do you want to know? How did he come to be the family physician?" "Through Hugh, originally. They were at school together. Leonard came to the village about 24 years ago. He'd had a practice in Edinburgh before, left it rather suddenly, which people remarked on." She paused. There had been a death. A wealthy patient, a widow, who died rather suddenly, and left a portion of her estate to Leonard. It was investigated quietly, because the family contested the will. Nothing was found, or at least, nothing was proved. The sitting room was very still, and the family here, do they know this? Hugh knew. He told Edith before he died. She told me, some years ago, in one of those late-night conversations people have when they have been keeping something too long. She was not alarmed, precisely. She trusted Leonard. She said Hugh had been satisfied that the Edinburgh matter was simply malicious family gossip. Dotty paused, though I noticed, after Hugh told her, that she was rather more careful about her will. How careful? She changed it, I believe, about 2 years ago. I don't know the details, but she visited the solicitor in the new year and came back looking settled, the way people look when they have arranged something they had been meaning to arrange. And Forbes, would he have known she had changed it? He might have guessed. He is a perceptive man. Dotty picked up her knitting, turned it over, and set it down once more. "Miss Marple, do you know who killed Thomas?" The fire shifted between them. Outside, a car moved slowly along the frozen lane and was gone. "I believe so," Miss Marple said. "But belief is not proof, and proof is what Inspector Harwell will require, and what Thomas deserves." "Then what do you need?" "One more conversation," Miss Marple said, "and I need you to help me arrange it." She found the clue she had missed in the kitchen, where she had gone ostensibly to ask Mrs. Baines about a cup of beef broth, and where she had engaged the cook in the comfortable, rambling conversation that women of a certain age conduct with such natural ease that no one thinks to notice how much information it contains. Baines talked about Thomas, how he had always thanked her for his tea, which Mr. Reginald did not always remember to do, and then, with the frankness of someone whose distress had momentarily shifted her calculations about what keeping secrets means, she mentioned that she had been up at midnight on Christmas Eve, checking the range was properly banked. She always did this, regular as clockwork, and had seen, from the kitchen window overlooking the side passage, a light in the east wing window at approximately 12:30. "Which window?" Miss Marple asked. "The end one, ma'am, the little study room, where Mr. Thomas was." She pressed her lips together. "And did you see anyone?" "I saw a shadow moving across the window, but only the once, and then the light went out, so I supposed it was Mr. Thomas settling in, and I didn't think any more of it." "Of course," Miss Marple said. "Very natural." But she was thinking that the light going out was the detail she had been looking for. Thomas had been alive and reading when Reginald left. The light had been on when Mrs. Baines saw the shadow, at 12:30, and then the light had gone out. Thomas, dying or already dead, had not turned it out. Someone else had. Someone composed enough to rinse the glass and walk, not run. Caroline had said the footsteps were not running, back along the corridor in the dark. And then she remembered something else. On Christmas morning, when Hayward had found Thomas and the household gathered in the entrance hall, Hayward had arrived from the direction of the east wing corridor, not from the stairs. Hayward had been in the east wing corridor. She set down the broth and went to find her outdoor shoes, because she needed to look at those footprints properly, from outside, before the frost lifted and they were gone. She walked the line of them slowly in the thin afternoon light, crouching carefully, with the consideration for her knees that her age required, to examine the print nearest the east wing's side door. The door had a latch rather than a knob. She tried it. It opened. The side door of the east wing was unlocked. She stood in the doorway for a moment, thinking, then closed it carefully and walked back to the house. She was almost certain now, not quite, but almost, and almost certain, was close enough to begin. She went to find Dottie and told her what she needed. Dottie listened with the focused attention of a woman who has been waiting to be useful, and said, "When? Tomorrow morning, at 10 o'clock. Can you bring them all to the drawing room? Every last one of them," said Dottie, with a quiet satisfaction that Miss Marple entirely understood. She went upstairs and sat in her chair and knitted for the first time that day. Actually knitted, the needles moving in their steady, rhythmic way, the wool drawing through her fingers with the familiar, small resistance she found more soothing than almost anything else she knew. She thought about Thomas Ashworth reading his old journals in the East Wing, and about the Christmas curse that was not a curse, but a calculation, and about the oldest truth she had learned in all her years of paying attention to the worst that people do to one another. It was never about the legend. It was never about the locked room, or the ancestral portrait, or the cold spot in the corridor. It was always, always about who stood to gain. The needles clicked softly in the lamplight. Tomorrow, she thought, tomorrow she would know everything. Outside, the stars came out over Ashworth Manor, very bright and very cold, and the frozen garden held its secrets in the ice, and waited. The oldest trick. The drawing room at Ashworth Manor had been arranged, on the morning of the 27th of December, into a loose semicircle of chairs facing the fireplace. Miss Marple arrived at 5 minutes to 10 and chose the chair nearest the fire, not from any desire for warmth, but because it placed her with the light behind her and the faces of the room before her, which was the arrangement she preferred. They came in ones and twos. Edith first, with Dotty, taking her usual chair with the upright composure of a woman who has decided that composure is still the gift she can offer. Reginald next, alone, sitting with his arms on his knees and his eyes moving around the room in the rapid assessing way of someone trying to determine in advance what is about to happen. Caroline behind him, sitting slightly apart, hands folded, face giving nothing away, though Miss Marple saw beneath the composure the vigilance of someone paying very close attention. Dr. Forbes arrived at 3 minutes past 10, stood for a moment in the doorway, took in the arrangement, and sat in the remaining chair with the ease of a man who has decided to meet whatever is coming without visible alteration. Hayward stood near the door. Inspector Harwell sat slightly apart by the window, notebook open. He had arrived at 9:30 at Miss Marple's request and had asked no questions, which she appreciated. When everyone was seated, Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. She did not stand. The elderly lady in the chair, the mild voice, the wool in the lap. It created a quality of attention that a barrister at the fireplace could not have managed. "Thank you all for coming," she said pleasantly. "I want to talk about Thomas. I want to begin with the Christmas curse." Reginald shifted. Dr. Revelborbs looked at his hands. Edith was very still. "The legend is genuine," Miss Marple continued. "The deaths it refers to largely occurred, but a legend, however genuine in its origins, can be borrowed. Someone in this house, over the past 2 weeks, has been borrowing it rather deliberately. The lights in the east wing, the sounds in the corridor, the portrait turned to the wall. These were not supernatural manifestations. They were a stage being set." She looked around the room. For Thomas, who had been spending his evenings in the east wing, reading the old journals. This was known to everyone. The curse, if it was to be invoked convincingly, needed to be centered there. And so it was. She looked at Edith gently. "Your son was not killed by a legend, Mrs. Ashworth. He was killed by someone who understood that the legend would explain his death, or at least complicate the explanation sufficiently that a local police surgeon on Christmas morning might accept the surface of things." Edith said nothing, looking at her hands with the expression of someone who has known, at some level, for 2 days and has been hoping to be proved wrong. "The wine," Miss Marple said. Reginald went very still. There was a decanter in the east wing study, and 2 glasses. "Reginald," she looked at him, not unkindly, "you have told me, and will tell Inspector Harwell, that you visited Thomas that evening, that you saw the decanter, that Thomas poured himself a glass just before you left, and that you refused. I believe you." Something in Reginald's face shifted. Relief, edged with complexity. The glass Thomas drank from was removed after his death, rinsed and placed in the kitchen dustbin. Thorough enough to be deliberate, but not thorough enough. It was found because someone placed it there hastily, because they had not planned to be the one removing it. They had found Thomas, and panicked, and acted. She paused. The glass was rinsed because it contained residue, digitalis, in excess, a means of producing cardiac failure that in a young man with no known history of heart trouble might present on Christmas morning as natural death. She looked at Dr. Forbes. "You examined Thomas that morning. You said the death had the appearance of a cardiac event, which was true, but you said, to me privately, that you believe in pathology reports, in a tone that suggested they would tell a particular story. I think you knew, when you examined Thomas, that the appearance and the reality were not the same thing. and I think you recognized the presentation. That is a serious allegation." Dr. Forbes said quietly. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "but I am not suggesting you administered the poison. I am suggesting that you recognized it, and that your recognition tells us something important about who did. You left the manor at 9:30 on Christmas Eve," she continued. "You drove back to the village. These facts are verifiable and true." She looked at him steadily. "But you returned. Not through the front door. Hayward would have heard that. Through the east wing's side door, which has a simple latch and can be opened from outside without a key. You came back because you were worried about Thomas." The silence was absolute. "I did not kill him," Dr. Forbes said. It came out quietly, and with a quality that Miss Marple recognized as truth. "No," she said. "I don't believe you did, but you were there. You saw who left, and you have said nothing for 2 days. I think you need to tell Inspector Harwell why." What Dr. Forbes said next, he said slowly and with care. He had returned at approximately midnight through the east wing side door. He had come back because Thomas had told him something on the 22nd, not only about the historical records, but about a letter from 7 years ago, between Hugh Ashworth and an individual who had been redirecting portions of the estate's income. Hugh had discovered it in the last year of his life and written to a solicitor. He had died before anything came of it. Thomas had found the solicitor's reply. He had made a deduction about who was responsible. He had told Dr. Forbes, and Forbes had told him to say nothing until it could be verified. Thomas had agreed. But at tea on Christmas Eve, he had mentioned the journal, in front of everyone. He had not named his deduction, but he had said enough for someone in that room to understand that he knew, or was very close to knowing. "I came back that night because I was afraid for him," Forbes said. "I came through the side door, along the passage. The light was on under the study door. I heard voices, very quiet. I couldn't make out words. Then the voices stopped, and I heard footsteps coming toward the door. I stepped back. Someone came out of the study and went back along the corridor toward the main wing." "Did you see them?" Inspector Harwell asked. "The corridor was dark. I saw a silhouette." "Could you identify it?" A long pause. "I thought I could, but I was not certain." And without certainty, he looked at Harwell. "I waited for the post-mortem. You went into the study after," Miss Marple said. "Yes. Thomas was barely breathing. He died within minutes. There was nothing to be done." He looked at his hands. "I turned the light out. I left the way I had come." He said it without excuse, which was the only honest way to say it. "The silhouette," Miss Marple said. "Was it a man or a woman?" Forbes looked across the semicircle, at Edith, at Reginald, at Caroline, and then at Miss Marple. "A woman," he said. The sound that followed was very small, a single breath, quickly controlled. Miss Marple had been listening for exactly that sound. She looked, in the moment of hearing it, at exactly the right face, not Caroline, Edith. Edith Ashworth's hands, still in her lap throughout, had tightened against each other with a grip that was perfectly eloquent. "Mrs. Ashworth," Miss Marple said gently, "I think you need to tell Inspector Harwell about the letter Thomas showed you." Edith looked at her for a long moment. "He came to me on Christmas Eve afternoon," she said at last. "Before tea. He had found another letter, to Hugh, from a solicitor, naming the source of the financial irregularities." She looked at her hands. "And naming someone I had trusted for 22 years. She looked at Dr. Forbes with an expression that contained something that was not hatred and not grief, but was somewhere between them. "Leonard," she said, "Hugh had found out, in the last year of his life, that Leonard had been taking from accounts he managed on the family's behalf. Hugh wrote to a solicitor. He died before anything came of it." "I did not steal," Forbes said, and the quality in his voice was something beneath the professional composure. from a place rarely exposed. I borrowed, twice. I repaid both amounts within 6 months, with interest. I should have asked. But I did not steal, and I had nothing to do with Hugh's death. Then why? Inspector Harwell said quietly. Did you say nothing when Thomas was found? Because I understood immediately how it would appear. Motive, presence, and no way to prove I had not entered the room before Thomas died. He looked at Miss Marple, and because I knew I had not done it, and I believed I knew who had, he looked at Edith, and Edith looked back, and the look between them contained 22 years of history, and Miss Marple watched it and understood. The silhouette was not the person who administered the poison, Miss Marple said. The room shifted. The silhouette was Edith, going to find Thomas, to talk to him about the letter, to think together about what to do. She went as a mother, not with any intention of harm, but when she arrived, he was already dying. He was on the floor, Edith said, from a great distance. I knelt beside him. I said his name. He didn't respond, and then he was gone. A pause. I took the glass. I don't know why. I wasn't thinking. I rinsed it and put it in the bin. I thought if there was poison in it, and Leonard was suspected. She looked at Forbes. I did not think he had done it, but I did not know, and he has been part of this family for a very long time. So you protected him, Miss Marple said, even in your grief. I protected the possibility that he hadn't, Edith said, which is not quite the same thing. There is still, Miss Marple said, the question of who administered the poison. The room came back to attention. Reginald went to the East Wing and left Thomas alive. Edith arrived and found him dying. Forbes came after and found him gone. And between Reginald's departure and Edith's arrival, someone came. Someone who knew Thomas spent his evenings there, who knew about the decanter, who had been invoking the legend for 2 weeks, and who had urgent reason to ensure Thomas never visited a solicitor. She looked around the semicircle. The footsteps Caroline heard were 2 sets, Reginald going, and then, after an interval, someone lighter and faster, going toward the East Wing, not returning from it. She looked at Caroline. Caroline looked back, and something in her face shifted. Not surprise, but the expression of someone who has known something and is watching someone else arrive at the same place by a different route. You knew, Miss Marple said. I suspected, since yesterday morning. When I thought about the footsteps properly, the second set going, not returning, she looked at Inspector Harwell. I was going to tell you today. Who was it? Harwell asked. Caroline was quiet. Then she looked at her husband. Reginald had gone very still, looking at the carpet between his feet, with the expression of a man understanding something he has been refusing to understand. It wasn't me, he said, his voice flat and careful. I was there, and I left, and it wasn't me. I know, Caroline said, and her voice was the saddest thing said in that room all morning. I know it wasn't you, Reginald. She looked at Miss Marple, and Miss Marple looked back, and the understanding between them was complete. Inspector Harwell, Miss Marple said, I wonder if you might ask where Mrs. Baines keeps her household medicines. I believe you will find a preparation that is not strictly a household item, and one of its components will be missing. Inspector Harwell stood. He looked around the room, and his eyes settled on the one face that had not, throughout the entire preceding hour, said a single word. Hayward stood by the door, exactly as he had stood at the beginning. His face was what it always was, composed, dignified, the face of a man who has made a career of giving nothing away but his hands. Miss Marple had watched his hands throughout, and his hands, for the first time since she had met him, were not still. Mr. Hayward, Inspector Harwell said, I'd like you to come with me. What? After the snow. The arrest of William Hayward, 58 years old, butler of Ashworth Manor for 41 of them, took place at 11:23 on the morning of the 27th of December, in the kitchen passage outside Mrs. Baines's pantry, where Inspector Harwell and the young constable found, behind a row of preserves, a small brown glass bottle containing approximately 1/3 of its original volume of a solution the police surgeon would later confirm was a concentrated digitalis extract. Beside the bottle, pushed to the very back of the shelf, as though in haste, was a small glass medicine dropper. Mrs. Baines, when shown these items, sat down heavily on her kitchen stool and said nothing for nearly a minute. Then she said, in a voice from which all its usual warmth had entirely departed, that she had never seen either item before in her life, and that if Miss Hayward had put them there, he had had no business doing it. Hayward did not, at first, say anything at all. He stood in the kitchen passage very straight and very still, his face maintaining the professional composure that had served him for 4 decades. He looked like a man who has spent his entire adult life perfecting a particular performance and is not quite ready, even now, to stop performing it. But the bottle was there, and the dropper, and the digitalis, and Hayward had nowhere further to put any of it. He looked at the bottle in the constable's evidence bag for a long moment. Then he looked at Miss Marple. It was a strange look. Not hatred, not calculation, not fury. What it contained was something she could only describe as recognition. The recognition of someone who has been found out fairly, which is different from being found out by luck, and which, for a certain kind of person, carries its own austere significance. The east wing side door, he said quietly. Yes, Miss Marple said. I latched it myself, 40 years ago. There was never a key made for it that I know of. I was the only one who knew it opened from outside. You and Dr. Forbes, Miss Marple said, though he used that knowledge for a different purpose. Hayward was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in his face, not the composure breaking, but a fractional softening, as though a held breath had been very quietly released. The digitalis was from Mr. Reginald's prescription. He has a mild arrhythmia, has done for 3 years. Dr. Forbes prescribes it. The preparation I made was considerably stronger. He paused. I have a working knowledge of pharmaceutical matters. My father was a pharmacist. I grew up understanding these things. You knew the historical method, Miss Marple said. The 1891 death. I have been the keeper of this house's history for 41 years, Hayward said. And there was in his voice a note that was not pride exactly, but was its sober, complicated cousin. I know everything that has happened in it. Every death, every debt, every secret. The legend of the Christmas curse is mine. As much as the Ashworths, I have maintained it. I have kept it alive. He stopped. Because it was useful, Inspector Harwell said. Because I hoped it would never need to be used, Hayward said. And this, Miss Marple believed, was true. She had met a great many people who had prepared something and hoped never to use it. And the preparation and the hope were not contradictory, though they might appear so from the outside. And when Thomas began reading the old journals, Miss Marple said, you understood that he was getting close. He asked me, 3 weeks ago, whether I had any recollection of certain account books from the 1950s. I told him I did not. That was not accurate. He looked at his hands, then away. I managed this estate's household finances for 30 years under Mr. Hugh Ashworth. I was trusted absolutely. And I, over a period of years, took small amounts. Not for extravagance. I lived simply. But I had obligations. A sister who was ill for a long time. Bills that my salary did not quite cover. He stopped. There is no explanation that makes it right. No. Miss Marple agreed. There isn't. Mr. Hugh discovered it in the last year of his life. He confronted me. We reached an agreement. I would repay every penny over time, and he would not take it further. He was a just man, more just than I had any right to expect. He looked at the floor. He died before the repayment was complete. I finished it nonetheless. Every penny, with interest. Mrs. Ashworth has never known. But the records still existed, Miss Marple said. The letter Hugh had written to the solicitor. I did not know about that letter. I knew about the account books. I thought without additional documentation, any conclusion Thomas drew would be unverifiable. He paused. I did not know that Hugh had written to the solicitor. If I had, things might have been different, though I prefer not to think about that. He said this last with the quiet precision of a man who has decided, having done the worst thing he has ever done, to be honest about the smaller things. Inspector Harwell said the words that needed to be said, and Hayward listened with the same steadiness, because he was, beneath everything, a man who respected form. He was taken out through the kitchen door, which was closer than the front, and Miss Marple watched him go, and thought about the 41 years he had spent in this house, and about the particular terrible arithmetic by which a long life of service and a handful of wrong choices arrive, finally, at a kitchen passage on the morning of the 27th of December, with an evidence bag and a set of handcuffs. She went back to the drawing room and sat down and picked up her knitting. The house was very quiet for the remainder of the morning. Edith remained in the drawing room for a long time, sitting very upright, accepting tea from Hayward's replacement with a mechanical courtesy. Dotty sat beside her and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing to do. Reginald went to the study and closed the door. Caroline did not follow him. She went instead to the window seat in the sitting room, Thomas's window seat, and sat there with a book she did not open, looking out at the frozen garden. Miss Marple, passing the doorway, thought that Caroline Ashworth was a more perceptive and courageous woman than most people in her life had given her credit for, and that this might, in time, become apparent to more people than it currently was. Dr. Forbes came to find Miss Marple at 12:30. He looked as though he had aged somewhat in the preceding 2 hours, not dramatically, but in the subtle, definitive way that certain mornings age people. I owe you an apology, he said, for not speaking sooner. You owe it to Thomas, Miss Marple said, pleasantly but precisely, and to Inspector Harwell, and perhaps, in a different way, to Edith. He accepted this without flinching. When did you know about Hayward? I knew the shape of it the morning after Thomas died, she said. The curse had been performed by someone with thorough knowledge of the house and its history, that pointed strongly toward Hayward. The side door confirmed the access. The footsteps Caroline heard were quick and light. The footsteps of someone who knows a house so well they do not need to think about where they are putting their feet, even in the dark. She paused. But knowing the shape is not the same as knowing the substance. I needed the pharmaceutical connection, the link to Reginald's prescription, the financial history. Those I did not have until this morning. And if Hayward had disposed of the bottle more thoroughly, Forbes said, the post-mortem would have found the digitalis regardless, and the digitalis would have pointed to someone with access to Reginald's prescription. There are not very many such people. She looked at him steadily. It is, in my experience, one of the more reliable facts about people. They keep things they should discard and underestimate the value of what they believe to be a small detail. He looked at her for a moment. You are a remarkable woman, Miss Marple. I am a very ordinary woman, she said, with complete sincerity. I simply pay attention. Most people find it rather easier not to. In the afternoon, Edith came to her. She came alone, for the first time since Thomas's death, and sat in the chair across from Miss Marple and looked at her before speaking. I want to thank you. I know that Dotty arranged for you to come, and was more specific in what she asked for than I realized. But I am glad. Whatever the outcome is, I am glad to know the truth. I am sorry, Miss Marple said, "that the truth is so painful. Truth usually is." Edith looked at the fire. "Thomas used to say that I was too protective of this house, that I treated the manor as though it were a person, with feelings to be spared. He was right. He was very often right, and I was not always gracious about acknowledging it. And now I cannot tell him so." Miss Marple said nothing, because there was nothing to say that was not smaller than the thing itself. After a moment, Edith said, "Hayward has been here longer than my children. I trusted him with everything. I thought I knew him." "You knew him," Miss Marple said gently. "What you knew was real. People are not simply what their worst action reveals. They are also everything else. And 41 years of everything else is a great deal. The two things are both true, and they do not cancel each other, and that is what makes it so very difficult." Edith looked at her. "Does that ever become easier to hold? The two true things?" "A little," Miss Marple said. "In time. Not because one becomes less true, but because life has a way of requiring one's attention even when one would rather not give it." Edith nodded slowly. Then she straightened, that characteristic straightening, and looked at Miss Marple with an expression that was not yet composed, but was on its way. "There! Will you stay for a few more days? I should be glad of someone here who is not family, and not implicated, someone who can simply be present." "Of course," Miss Marple said. "I had nowhere particular to be until the new year in any case, and Mrs. Baines's cooking, in happier circumstances, is really very fine." Edith almost smiled. It was small and brief, and it cost her something, but it was real. And it was the first real one since Christmas morning, and it counted for something. The snow came again that evening. Not the heavy, determined snow of Christmas Eve, but the softer kind, settling on the window ledges and the stone falcons above the front door, with the quiet impartiality of something that has no opinion about the house it is covering. Miss Marple sat by the window and watched it come down, and thought about Thomas, who had been 23 years old and had thought in straight lines, and had not considered that someone might not wait for him to take what he knew to a solicitor. She thought about Hayward, who had given 41 years of meticulous service and had compounded his wrong choices, in the end, with the worst one available, and who would spend the remainder of his life in the specific company of that fact. She thought about the difference between a locked room and an unlatched door, and about how often things that look like mysteries turn out to be simply failures of attention, other people's or her own. She noted her own errors in this case without kindness, because kindness to oneself, on the subject of one's errors, is a luxury that tends to produce more errors, small things that had not altered the outcome, but she kept them because accuracy required it. The snow fell. The fire was good. Somewhere in the kitchen, Mrs. Baines was making something that smelled of onions and thyme, and the particular comfort that only food prepared with genuine attention can provide. The oldest curses, she thought, are often just excuses for the newest crimes. It was not a comforting thought, but it had the advantage of being true, and true thoughts, however uncomfortable, were considerably more useful than comfortable ones. And the advantage they had over curses was very simple. You could do something about them. She picked up her knitting, and the needles began to move, and the dark wool drew through her fingers in the quiet room. And outside, the snow fell softly over Ashworth Manor, and the house stood in the winter evening as it had stood for 200 years. Miss Jane Marple knitted on and was content.